In the shadows of Sunderland, England, tragedy struck as 7-year-old Nikki Allen was forcefully taken from her home on October 7, 1992. Thus began a 3-decade struggle for justice, a relentless battle fueled by a mother's love. Wrongful accusations plagued the case, delaying the identification of the true killer. But secrets, lies, and a web of deception couldn't withstand the unyielding pursuit of truth. How did the criminal evade justice for over 30 long years? And when justice came, was it enough? Hi, and welcome back to Mysterious 7 Friends. Today we're looking at the disturbing case of Nikki Allen, a cold case that was solved after 31 years. So without any further ado, let's dive right into this mystery. In 1992, Sunderland, a city located in the northeast of England, faced a challenging situation with its shipyards closing down and its coal mine on the verge of being shut down. Despite some positive developments like a car factory and a university campus, there was resistance to change and a desire to hold on to the past. The region also struggled with high rates of car thefts, especially involving young offenders who became notorious figures in the media. Unemployment was high in certain areas, with some housing estates falling into disrepair. One such estate, called Weregarth, faced issues with difficult tenants. Overall, the city was caught between a desire for progress and a reluctance to let go of its industrial past. And this is where the Allen family lived. On October 7, 1992, a Wednesday, Nikki attended school as usual. When she returned home in the evening, she found her mother Sharon overwhelmed with laundry. Feeling unwell and wanting to escape the noise and steam from the dryers, Sharon decided to visit Jenny, her stepmother, hoping to find some painkillers. Zara and Naomi, Nikki's sisters, were already asleep, while Stacy was engrossed in watching television. However, Nikki insisted on accompanying her mother to Jenny's. Upon arrival, Nikki's grandfather, Dickie Prest, was vacuuming and refused to stop despite Nikki's fear of the noise. Frightened, Nikki ran back home, which was just 2 blocks away. Her mother promised to follow shortly after. It was around 8:30 p.m. when Nikki decided to go home alone. Weregarth, the area they lived in, was a secure space where children often played outside until late in the evening. Tragically, Nikki was taken within mere moments of leaving her grandfather's house. To reach their flat from her grandfather's place, Nikki only had to walk down a flight of stairs and then along a short lane, which would take a maximum of 5 minutes. Since they'd been living there for a while and it was in the same building, Sharon didn't consider it particularly dangerous. Sharon left around 10 minutes after Nikki. However, upon Sharon's return home, Nikki was nowhere to be found. Realizing that Nikki was missing, Sharon began knocking on doors frantically. Concerned neighbors came out to offer assistance, and the police were called. A police helicopter was also called so that it could give the police a view from the above and search for the girl. By the time the helicopter arrived, Sharon was in such distress that she was taken to her father, Dickie's flat, where she received tranquilizers. In her heavily sedated condition, she couldn't move and could only hear whispers around her. Troubling thoughts crossed her mind that maybe Nikki had fallen into the river. Maybe she went to the docks with a friend, fell in, and the friend was too scared to confess. The following morning, Nikki's shoes and coat were discovered in an abandoned building known as the Quayside, just a few yards away from the flats where Nikki, her grandfather, and her mother resided. The building had fallen into disrepair, was covered in graffiti, and was generally avoided by people. Overwhelmed by distress, Sharon's condition became severe enough that someone called for an ambulance. At that time, Gail and Vina were Sharon's neighbors. Gail was Sharon's sister, while Vina was her real mother. Although Vina and Sharon were not on speaking terms, Gail offered to accompany Sharon to the hospital, but unexpectedly, Vina appeared at the ambulance door, pushing Gail aside. Despite their strained relationship, Vina took charge. Once at the hospital, Sharon received additional diazepam to help calm her. Meanwhile, both the police and the local community had been notified of Nikki's abandoned shoes and coat, prompting them to investigate the derelict building. On October 8th at 10:40 a.m., a teenage boy made a tragic discovery in the basement. A lifeless Nikki, lying in a pool of her own blood. Despite being fully clothed, except for her missing shoes and coat, Nikki had suffered 37 stab wounds and had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Heartbreakingly, Nikki's grandfather was the one who had to identify her lifeless body. By that time, Sharon had returned from the hospital and found herself in a bedroom of a high-rise building in Sunderland with Vina. On October 9th, the police determined that a house brick was the weapon used to strike Nikki on the head, leading to her demise. They believed that this caused her death rather than the stab wounds inflicted. The same day, a man covered in blood was apprehended but later released without charges. By October 12th, an artist released a sketch of a man who was reportedly the last person seen with Nikki before her murder. The image was shared with the media and the public by the police in hopes of generating leads. On October 13th, a photograph of Nikki wearing the clothes she had on the night that she disappeared and was killed was released to the public. The authorities sought any information from individuals who may have seen her with someone. Desperate for any leads, the police shared all available information. A reconstruction of Nikki's last known movements was conducted on October 14th, aiming to assist the search for her killer. Just 4 days later, on October 18th, a significant breakthrough occurred when the police made their first major arrest. Less than 2 weeks after the discovery of Nikki's body, a local man named George Heron, 24 years old, was taken into custody. He'd recently moved into the Garce area a few months prior. George, locally known as the eccentric oddball, had a regular presence in the derelict building where Nikki's lifeless body was discovered. Despite minimal evidence pointing directly to his guilt, the community swiftly focused their suspicions on him, convinced that he was the one responsible for Nikki's murder. Amidst this chaotic situation, on October 30th, 1992, Nikki Allen was laid to rest at Sunderland Cemetery. After Nikki's burial, the investigation into her murder persisted. George Heron, who'd recently moved in with his sister just weeks before the tragic incident, initially denied knowing Nikki when questioned by the police. However, several locals came forward, asserting that they had witnessed George in the company of Nikki on multiple occasions. The nature of their interactions remains unclear, as children often played freely without close parental supervision in the area surrounding the flats. Additional evidence emerged during the investigation. A knife blade discovered in George's residence matched the stab wounds found on Nikki's body. Furthermore, blood splatter was detected on his shoes and clothes, although the significance of this discovery remains uncertain. Given that this occurred in 1992, DNA testing wasn't as advanced as it is today, so this splatter couldn't be tested. Significantly, George's sister informed the police that on the night of Nikki's murder, George returned home and immediately proceeded to the bathroom to wash his clothes. He devoted around half an hour to cleansing himself and his garments, which struck his sister as highly unusual behavior as it deviated from his normal routine. Initially, George denied venturing out that evening. However, eyewitness testimonies from locals surfaced, placing him at the local pub where he purchased cheese and onion crisps, known to be Nikki's favorite snack. The police believe that George used these crisps as a lure to entice Nikki into the abandoned building where she was tragically killed. Following 3 days of intensive police questioning, George ultimately confessed to the murder of Nikki, shedding light on the harrowing truth behind her untimely demise. Jen Jarvie was a private investigator. She'd be supporting Sharon over the coming years, and she claimed that the way in which the police questioned George was in itself shady.
I'm Jen Jarvie. I'm a private investigator and lecturer in professional policing, and I have reviewed the Nikki Allen case. The police have a difficult job. They have a difficult job to do, and particularly with a child murder. However, in this particular case, they failed Sharon. They failed Nikki, monumentally to begin with, but then continue to do that for a lot of years. They had an ideal suspect there, and they failed to pinpoint him time and time again. The difference, which is usually the case in most cold cases, is the fact that they were able to progress forensics and DNA, and were able to actually pinpoint DNA on Nikki's body that belonged categorically to David Boyd.
A year later, in October 1993, George's trial commenced in Leeds. Initially intended to be held in Sunderland, concerns arose about the possibility of George not receiving a fair trial due to the intense anger and hostility within the community. Threats of murder and lynching directed towards him were prevalent, as evidenced by newspaper articles documenting the community's vengeful desires. To mitigate these risks, the trial was relocated to Leeds, with the hope that the change in location would dissuade locals from attending and inciting further disturbances. However, contrary to expectations, the distance proved to be no deterrent. Locals defied the geographical barrier, making the journey to Leeds daily to witness the trial proceedings. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tumultuous. Spectators had to be restrained as they shouted and displayed unruly behavior. the trial unfolded in a chaotic manner, reflecting the charged emotions surrounding the case. Notably, members of Nikki's extended family also attended these trials, seeking justice for their lost loved one. After reviewing all 12 interview tapes, the judge presiding over George's case determined that 7 of them could not be used as evidence due to the police employing questionable methods to extract a confession. This ruling occurred as a result of the extensive and controversial tactics employed during the interrogation process, which cast doubt on the reliability of the recorded statements. Following a 6-week trial, due to the questionable evidence, the case was labeled a mistrial, and the judge instructed the jury to deliver a not guilty verdict, which instantly sparked chaos within the courtroom. The scene erupted with screams, shouts, and emotional outbursts. Sharon, overcome by the shocking decision, fainted amongst the turmoil. The intense reaction from the public necessitated the intervention of security personnel to restore order. Even the judge had to be swiftly escorted from the courtroom. The aftermath of the verdict was met with outrage, particularly because many firmly believed in George's guilt. In light of the volatile situation, George was granted a change of identity and relocated away from Sunderland. This decision further fueled public anger. Unleashing their frustration, an act of arson targeted the solicitor's office involved in the case. Another uncomforting revelation emerged, shedding light on potential police corruption. So, in between the trials, Sharon received an invitation to visit a prison and personally express gratitude to an individual who had inflicted permanent scars on George's face, allegedly as an act of retribution. After that, since 1993, no one had been charged with the murder of Nikki Allen. The case would remain cold for years to come. But after these trials, George's life completely took a turn. George had experienced his fair share of being picked on during his life. When he was attending primary school, his parents went through a divorce, and his mother, Sue, moved in with Alex Heron. George managed to form a positive bond with his new stepfather. However, tragedy struck when Alex passed away from a heart attack when George was just 9 years old. This event had a profound impact on him, shaping his demeanor as he grew older. When 11-year-old George enrolled at St. Aidan's, a boys' secondary school administered by the Christian Brothers, he'd already been labeled as an outsider. An incident that further solidified this reputation occurred when George arrived at class one morning, still wearing the hood of his duffel coat. Despite the teacher's request to remove it, he adamantly refused. In response, the teacher forcefully pulled off the hood, inadvertently revealing a scraped and bloodied scalp underneath. Rumor had it that George's hair had been forcibly shaved as a punishment for his poor academic performance. Subsequently, some of his fellow students started referring to him as E.T., alluding to the resemblance between his wide eyes and the fictional extraterrestrial alien from Steven Spielberg's film E.T. At the time of Nikki's murder, George resided in Waregarth with his younger sister, the 19-year-old Michelle, her boyfriend Darren Psycho Baker, and her 2 children. Although he initially claimed not to know Nikki when questioned by the authorities, there was a degree of familiarity between them. On occasions, Nikki would play with George's nephew, and he'd even offered her sweets. Joe Bradley, a retired constable now, had taken care of George Heron between police interviews. Their conversation revealed how deeply the belief in a suspect's guilt could permeate an entire police force. It was expected that officers responsible for watching over prisoners would try to establish rapport with them and provide feedback to the Criminal Investigation Department, or the CID. Although anything discussed outside the confines of the interview room would be inadmissible in court, it could still be utilized as ammunition. Initially, Bradley struggled to get any response from George. However, after some time, he decided to offer him a cup of hot chocolate, which seemed to break the ice. George began to open up, expressing concerns about what would happen to him. Bradley reassured him, stating that if he hadn't committed the crime, he had nothing to worry about. George, though, mentioned that others were accusing him of the murder. Bradley advised him not to pay attention to the accusations, emphasizing that if he was innocent, he should disregard them. However, Bradley also warned him that if he was truly responsible, he needed to stop evading the truth and start cooperating with the investigators, as forensic evidence would eventually reveal the truth. Bradley believed that George was on the verge of confessing, but after a significant pause, he denied his involvement. Shortly afterward, Bradley received word that George had, in fact, confessed to the crime. During George's initial appearance at Sunderland Magistrates Court, Bradley found himself in the dock alongside him. From the public gallery, a man suddenly lunged towards George, prompting Bradley to swiftly subdue him. As the commotion unfolded, a woman at ground level screamed, identifying George as the father of some child and a murderer. Bradley observed the man's tears and, moved by compassion, embraced him tightly, offering solace. After the hearing, Bradley accompanied George to Durham Jail. In an effort to shield him from the intrusive camera lenses of photographers, they placed a blanket over his head and instructed him to lie down inside the van. As they departed, George inquired if he could sit up, but one of the senior officers insisted that he remained covered, viewing him as a child murderer. Bradley firmly believed in George's guilt, as he'd been informed by higher-ranking officers that his confession aligned with the forensic evidence. However, Heron's confession only matched the investigators' desired narrative because they'd manipulated him into providing the desired account. This conversation occurred later on the second day, after George had already confessed to Detective Chief Inspector John Renwick and Detective Inspector Colin Dudley, who'd taken over the questioning from other officers. Throughout the exchange, you can hear them guiding George towards the answers they wanted to hear. When George suggests using a metal bar as the weapon, they indicate that it's the wrong response, subtly implying the idea that a knife might be the correct one.
George, how are you, son? Just finish it off and tell us what you did.
Went to throttle her.
You went to throttle her? What with?
Me hands.
But you hit her with something else, didn't you, George?
Don't remember.
George, think. I know it's not very nice, son, but just think. What else did you hit her with? George?
Fist.
What else? Howie, George, you used something else, didn't you? George, we know. Howie, George, what else did you do? Come on.
Piece of metal.
If they hadn't already formed their own conclusions, they might have noticed that their sole suspect seemed unaware of certain details regarding the murder he claimed to have committed. For instance, when he initially mentioned using a piece of metal, he told the officers he'd inserted it between Nikki's legs, despite there being no evidence of that kind of assault. Later, the detectives got George to tell them how many times he stabbed Nikki. Renwick and Dudley alternate between scolding and comforting Heron. They bring him down and then assert that they're the only ones who truly understand him. They employ tactics that appeal to his Catholic faith, questioning his beliefs about heaven and hell. They try to redirect his focus from himself to expressing compassion and sorrow for Nikki Allen. However, Heron insists that he's always prioritized others over himself. Professor David Dixon, an expert in police practices at the University of New South Wales, carefully examined Heron's interviews. In his report titled Integrity, Interrogation, and Criminal Injustice, Dixon suggests that the police may have been influenced by the Reid technique, a controversial interrogation utilized in the United States since the 1950s. One particular step of this technique involved attempting to portray the crime as something that anyone in a similar situation might have done. As Dixon highlighted, when Heron started to implicate himself, he echoed the less severe version of events that the detectives had proposed to him. George didn't have a qualified solicitor to complain about the interrogation tactics used against him. Instead, he had an unqualified solicitor's representative who, at the end of the interviews, expressed satisfaction with how they'd been conducted. However, the judge reviewing the transcripts, Mr. Justice Mitchell, expressed serious concerns. He noted that George had not seen a qualified solicitor until he appeared in court, despite being fluent and articulate throughout the interviews. Mitchell considered the interviews to be an oppressive exercise aimed at breaking George's resolve. The detectives had also exaggerated the strength of the evidence against him, with only one witness, Margaret Hodgson, claiming to have seen George with the victim. Furthermore, Hodgson was not asked to attend an identity parade until after the interviews, where she failed to identify George. Initially, Northumbria police defended their interviews, but they eventually agreed to an inquiry. The resulting report recommended tailored training for officers investigating serious crimes and the adoption of the peace method, which allowed suspects to provide an uninterrupted account of events before confronting them with inconsistencies. Bradley, troubled by how George was treated, anticipated the possibility of an attack when handing him over to prison officers. He later expressed remorse for his feelings at that time, empathizing with what George must have endured. George was safely escorted out of Leeds Crown Court with the help of a decoy police van. He was taken to a hotel by Robin Patton, one of his lawyers, and then to a monastery where he reunited with his mother. The following day, he was driven to Morpeth railway station, and wearing a baseball cap to avoid recognition, he boarded a train to Scotland. A photograph taken before his departure showed Heron looking thin and vulnerable, holding a plastic bag with his belongings. Nigel Green was the crime and investigations reporter on the Sunderland Echo. Sunderland's local newspaper at the time. He met George after he was cleared at Leeds Crown Court.
I met George after he was cleared at Leeds Crown Court. The arrangement was that I would pick him up from a monastery somewhere in the wilds outside Leeds, and I had to pick him up and drive him to, I was supposed to drive him to Scotland. On that particular night, it was a winter's night, and it was snowing heavily. And I thought, well, we are not going to make it to Scotland. So I stopped at a train station in Morpeth and put him on a train to Scotland. He had a mother that I met. They lived in Pennywell. They were from a deprived background. When I met him at this monastery somewhere on the outskirts of Leeds, he'd spent a year on remand in prison. He was thin. He was very gaunt. It's clear that he wasn't a killer. And I hope that he can now get on with his life.
Following George's acquittal, the Allen family found themselves without any sense of closure or justice for the loss of their young daughter. No one was held accountable for the death of their little girl, leaving them with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. After Nicky's death and Heron's acquittal, Sharon faced a lot of criticism. False rumors circulated, claiming that Nicky wasn't well-fed or dressed appropriately. People accused Sharon of being a drinker who used money from collection tins meant for Nicky's funeral to buy alcohol. They labeled her as a carefree woman and questioned why she would let a 7-year-old wander alone on a cold October night. Sharon came from a family with a troubled reputation. Her father, Dickie Prest, and her brother Greg were frequently involved in various problems. In 1961, Dickie Prest, a former docker, married Vina Creighton. They had 5 children: Greg, Joan, Tony, Sharon, and Sandra. However, they got divorced in 1969 when Sharon was just 3 years old. Opinions differ on Dickie's character, with some considering him a rogue or a thug. Sharon recalled him as occasionally friendly, but also somewhat menacing. She remembered being taken to the hospital with wounds and bruises that were from Dickie hitting her. She was then placed in foster care at the age of 3. She spent most of her time between the ages of 3 and 14 in different care homes, but she viewed it as normal for her. During that period, Sharon only saw her dad once when he attended a social work meeting. However, when she turned 14, he started spending time with school friends in Weregarth, where Dickie lived with his second wife, Jenny, and their 3 children, Gail, Nicky, and Alan. Her siblings hadn't been in touch with her, and the only family member she considered close was Greg, who sadly passed away due to alcohol-related issues in 2015. Sharon disliked Vina and resented Dickie, but she held affection for Jenny. Jenny suggested that Sharon move into their flat, and Sharon, who'd never experienced having a mother figure, gladly accepted. Gail, Nicky, and Alan were young at that time, and sharing bedrooms didn't bother Sharon because she was happy to have a family. For a girl who'd been shuffled from place to place, the close-knit community of Weregarth provided a sense of belonging. Having a role model like Jenny encouraged Sharon to earn money by babysitting and delivering newspapers. Soon, she started dating David Allen, one of her neighbors. By the age of 16, she became pregnant with Stacy and later with Nicky. However, Sharon and David broke up not long after Nicky's birth. She then entered a relationship with Anthony Waldron, whose mother, Shirley, worked as a welfare rights officer. Sharon and Anthony had 2 more children, Zara in 1989 and Naomi in 1991. However, Anthony's mother disapproved of Sharon being a single parent, causing arguments that eventually led Sharon to ask Anthony to leave. 6 months before Nicky's tragic death, the family moved into a ground-floor flat in Weregarth. Sharon admitting to facing challenges, but enjoyed being a mother, despite never experiencing motherly care herself. Considering her circumstances, she did a commendable job. Sharon took Stacy and Nicky to school, and Zara and Naomi to nursery. She made sure they were well-fed, clean, dressed appropriately, and even tied their hair with ribbons. It was the 2000s now. In the years that followed after George's acquittal, Sharon relied heavily on diazepam and MD 2020, and her daughters ended up in foster care at times. She got married, but later divorced. Sadly, it appeared that the police had given up on finding answers about Nicky. When Sharon tried to inquire if they'd pursued any leads, she was ignored. Eventually, she started reducing her medication, worked on rebuilding her relationships with her daughters, and went through another marriage and divorce. Although she continued to struggle with drinking and at times felt she might drink herself to death. Around early 2003, she began forming friendships with other mothers facing similar challenges. One of these mothers was Ann Ming, who in 1990 tragically discovered her daughter Julie's body under her bathtub months after Cleveland police had searched her apartment. Despite her own struggles, she wasn't ready to let go of what happened to Sharon, and she continued her fight for justice. She took legal action against George in civil court and won the case when George failed to defend himself. The consequence was that George could face trial again if the case was ever reopened by the police with new evidence. Then, in September 2003, Ming successfully overturned the double jeopardy rule after her long campaign. In 2006, Billy Dunlop, who'd been acquitted of Julie's murder but later boasted about it, was charged again and pleaded guilty. This gave Sharon renewed hope. If Dunlop could face trial again, why not George, especially if they could find new DNA evidence? In 2006, understanding how the media operated, Sharon called journalists to Nikki's gravesite and expressed her desire to have the body exhumed for fresh tests. Sharon took it upon herself to do what the detectives in 1992 hadn't done, expand the investigation beyond George. She delved into who else was living in Ware Garth at the time and what their activities were during Nikki's murder. However, her quest for information sometimes resulted in accusations of disturbing the peace, causing damage, and harassment. It was late 2015, and 23 years had passed since Nikki's death. Sharon became aware of Terry Clark, the longtime partner of her sister Sandra. Terry played a role similar to Fagan, dealing with stolen goods brought to him by runners. She also discovered the two Carolines, a mother and daughter who lived 3 doors away from Dickie and Jenny. The older Caroline had previously babysat for Sharon. In October 1992, Sharon remembered that she was living with a man who happened to be one of Clark's runners, although she couldn't recall his name. To keep an eye on these women, Sharon decided to move to Ryhope as she didn't want to simply sit and cry at people's doors. But when all the doors were closing on Sharon, a new door opened in the form of a massive twist. Eventually, Sharon found what she'd been searching for. One day, Carolyn sent her a text message containing the name of the man she lived with during Nikki's murder, David Smith, also known as David Bell and David Boyd. Boyd had a long criminal history attached to his name, not just as a runner, but also as a routine offender. In 1986, Boyd faced a conviction for disturbing the peace when he approached 4 children aged between 8 and 10. He grabbed one of them and asked her for a kiss. In 2000, he was convicted of indecent assault for an incident in which he approached 2 girls, aged 12 and 9, at a park. He proceeded to touch the younger girl inappropriately. During a conversation with a probation officer, Boyd admitting having impure thoughts when he saw young girls and feeling excited about touching them. He discussed entering a phase around age 22, during which he would contemplate seeing young girls naked and having intimate encounters with them. It's noteworthy that he had one conviction for an offense involving children prior to Nikki's murder and another one afterward. In early 2016, Lisa Thieker, a detective chief inspector, was approached to review the case.
I'm Detective Chief Superintendent Lisa Thieker and I'm the Senior Investigating Officer in the Nikki Allen murder. So I was the Senior Investigating Officer in 2016 and in April of that year I went down to the lab to sit with the scientist James Chapman to look around what opportunities we had to do some testing on Nikki Allen's clothes and looking at other exhibits as well, including the brick. So there was new forensic techniques that was coming out around YSTR, so it was a real opportunity for us to revisit the exhibits that we still had to see if we could identify the offender. So that was in the April. James Chapman, the scientist, has worked throughout kind of like that year, and then in February 2017, that is when I first get information that we've got an unidentified profile. So at that point, in the February, I know that I've got a profile, but I don't know who it belongs to.
By that time, Sharon had compiled a lengthy list of potential suspects. Recognizing the potential of YSTR, a DNA analysis method, Thieker collaborated with DNA expert James Chapman to explore the option of retesting Nikki's clothing. In September of the same year, Sharon created an online petition urging a comprehensive review of the cold case. The following year, Sharon had a meeting with the then Chief Constable Steve Ashman after a Y profile was discovered on Nikki's clothes. Ashman made a commitment to conduct a thorough reinvestigation.
Any adults in my side of the family, Nikki's dad's side, people in the area, if Nikki had been like in the area, because the DNA could be on Nikki's coat of a few days ago if she's been in a friend's house and picked a male's DNA up. It's just to eliminate all that so they can get right to the main DNA.
Under the leadership of Thieker, the investigative team identified and tracked down hundreds of men who'd resided in the area during 1992, including David Boyd, based on information provided by Sharon. These individuals were approached and requested to provide DNA samples for comparison. In 2017, a fresh team of forensic experts took over the investigation into Nikki's case. At that time, Sharon also urged people to come to the police and give their DNA samples, especially people from her father's side. They made a significant announcement during a press conference, revealing that they discovered male DNA on Nikki's clothing. David Boyd provided his DNA sample on October 4, 2017. A month later, in November, forensic scientists confirmed a match between his DNA and the one found on the clothing. As a result, Boyd was arrested and questioned on April 17, 2018, and again in April 2019.
David? Yeah. Aye, how are you doing? From the No, no, from the police. Come have a word? Yeah. Cheers. Could you do us a favour and just knock the telly off for a second? What? Could you do us a favour and just knock the telly off just so you can hear what I'm saying? Thanks, mate. David, I'm Terry. This is Marty. We're part of the team that's reinvestigating the murder of Nicky Allen. Yeah. Okay. Part of that investigation has led us to suspect that you may have had some involvement in that. Okay. I'm arresting you on suspicion. Okay. Of that offence. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm the offence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Just leave your phone there for a moment.
Finally, in May 2022, he was formally charged in connection with the case. For Sharon, the quest for answers had spanned decades. Unfortunately, the pace of police investigation was far from satisfactory, leaving her waiting anxiously for resolution.
I'm Detective Chief Superintendent Lisa Thieker and I'm the Senior Investigating Officer in the Nicky Allen murder. The case presented and the understanding of the case is David Boyd was the last person to actually see Nicky Allen alive. We know we've got a number of sightings of Nicky playing inside the Garths, so we've got reliable sightings that we've been able to time. We know that we've got CCTV of David Boyd walking along Law Street with Nicky Allen skipping behind. He's then lured her and taken her to the old Exchange building, where we know that he's assaulted her outside and he's put her in that building. He's assaulted her numerous times with a brick and he's stabbed her repeatedly before dragging her body down to the basement of the old Exchange building. I've seen footage from back in the day in terms of the activity when the police was called. We know that the police helicopter was up, and then when the police have arrived, the neighbours have been out searching for Nicky. The whole community have come together looking for little Nicky in terms of where she's gone. Everybody was out searching for her throughout the night and until the next morning when she was found in the old Exchange building.
On April 20th, 2023, the trial of David Boyd began with a presentation of evidence in Court 1. Richard Wright, the prosecuting barrister, prepared to show a video depicting the murder scene, cautioning the jurors that its content would be disturbing. Despite the pixelation concealing Nicky's body, the video would reveal bloodstains. Boyd, a man with a dragon tattoo peeking out from his white t-shirt, remained impassive as he observed the footage on his screen.
You lured Nicky Allen away from the relative safety of the Garths by telling her lies. Only you know what you said to her to cause her to leave the Garths with you shortly before 10 p.m. on the 7th of October 1992. But somehow, you tricked her into going with you in the opposite direction to her home and on a cold and dark night.
The camera captured Nicky's final path through the old Exchange building, starting from the boarded-up window at the rear where she'd been pushed, all the way to the basement where her lifeless body was discarded. The footage lingered in a ground floor room, exposing the peeling paint, broken floorboards, and graffiti. It then zoomed in on a bloodied brick and a stain on the far wall, signifying the farthest point from which Nicky could have tried to escape her assailant, as Wright explained.
A witness saw you both on your way to the old Exchange building, you leading the way and Nicky skipping along after you. The impression of that witness was that you were father and daughter. You didn't need to use force because Nicky knew you and she trusted you. The jury heard evidence that Nikki was shy and clingy to her mother, not a child who would have been inclined to go off with a stranger. But you knew Nikki's family, and they knew you.
Just before Wright drew attention to the blood on the staircase edges, Sharon chose to leave the courtroom. It was revealed that each step had served as a jarring impact point for Nikki's head as she fell down. The camera proceeded to trace the drag marks from the base of the staircase, leading through the basement and into the room where Nikki's body had been discovered, lying on her left side. Briefly hovering over the pixelated figure in the corner, it captured the distinct emerald green of her t-shirt before shifting away.
Your purpose in luring Nikki away to the old exchange building was sexual. You intended to sexual assault Nikki either in the grounds of the old exchange building or in the building itself. You were aged 25 at the time. Nikki was 7 years old. There could have been no benign reason for your wishing to trick Nikki into going with you to an isolated derelict building. Using common sense, there could be no other reason for you luring her away as you did for anything other than a sexual reason.
After lunch, Wright requested the presence of a mannequin, slightly taller than Nikki at 49.6 inches. The mannequin was dressed exactly like Nikki, wearing red kickers, knee-length white socks, black leggings, a green t-shirt, and a purple coat with a pink floral lining. It was positioned on a table before the jurors. They'd previously been informed that Nikki had entered the old exchange building without her coat and shoes, which were discovered near the red brick boundary wall. Testimonies from a neighbor mentioned hearing two piercing screams emanating from the direction of the building, while a woman leaving the McFish factory described a noise resembling a wailing cat or the howling wind.
And took steps to conceal what you'd done. You did your best to hide Nikki's body by dragging her down into the dark cellar, where you dumped her in the far corner of the room furthest away from the staircase. No one would have been likely to have found her body had they not been looking for it in the cellar with a decent torch. You then covered yourself by giving false information to the police. You provided yourself with a neat but false alibi, claiming to have been away from the Garths, getting fish and chips for a friend at the time when Nikki was killed.
Wright's strategic move helped establish key aspects of the prosecution's case, as navigating the building in complete darkness to move Nikki's body would have required an intimate familiarity with its layout, and that the areas of Nikki's clothing where Boyd's DNA was found were the exact points the killer would have needed to touch in order to bring her into the building. During his testimony, DNA expert James Chapman revealed that the fresh investigation into Nikki's murder in 2016 had yielded an almost complete Y-profile match to Boyd. The matching DNA was discovered near the top of Nikki's t-shirt and around the right hip area near the waistband of her leggings, with a partial match found at the right armpit of the t-shirt. Wright highlighted that the hip and armpit were the most probable areas of Nikki's body that the murderer would have had come into contact with while lifting her. Boyd had no male relatives residing in Sunderland, making the odds of his Y-profile matching an unrelated individual 1 in 28,000. The police had collected DNA samples from hundreds of men connected to the East End in 1992, but no other matches were found. Wright urged the jury to consider the DNA evidence within its proper context.
You are now 55 years old. When you committed this murder, you were 23 years old. You appeared before the court on 22 occasions for 45 offences. The majority of your offending has been acquisitive, but your sexual attraction to 7-year-old Nikki Allen was not an isolated incident.
Wright asserted that Boyd also bore a striking resemblance to an artist's impression created with the assistance of Margaret Hodgson, who'd witnessed a man accompanied by a skipping girl on Low Street shortly before 10 p.m. The police had come across a photograph of Boyd taken in the early 1990s, showing him casually seated in an armchair with his left leg slung over his right. Wright presented the two images side by side, revealing a noticeable similarity.
The last drawer.
Oh, yeah, you'll have your time, Charlie. You get your time.
This is the worst injustice.
Oh, yeah. Away.
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 For the speech. Can you say that? Yeah, something for you. Away, sure.
And so, after the trial, things were clear that the nonchalant David Boyd, still sitting comfortably in the courtroom, was to be pronounced guilty of the murder of the 7-year-old Nikki Allen. And thus, after 30 years of longing, Sharon got her closure. The Waregarth community saw a murderer go to jail, the police found their culprit, and George Heron got a clean chit from the locals. David Boyd's trial ended on May 12, 2023, when the jury took just 90 minutes to decide he was guilty of murdering Nikki. After the trial, the first thing the police did was to offer an apology letter to George Heron. But Sharon was still unhappy with how the trial went. After all, Boyd would be allowed parole after 29 years.
Nikki, the way she was murdered, and I've had to listen to it, it's horrendous. I cannot think in my brain how bad it is. And I thought life would have meant life without parole. I've been let down again by the justice system and the police force. The police force that's on Nikki's case now, because somebody forgot to tell us that they were going to apologise, and then somebody forgot to tell us that they were going to use the old justice system. Same old thing all the time. Same old thing.
Sharon did not accept this. She wanted life imprisonment for Boyd without the possibility of parole. But as per the law at that time, in 1992, this sentence wasn't permissible. Nowadays, Sharon resides in Roker, a lovely area of Sunderland. Her home features a small garden with a little patch of soil. Within that patch, stone angels stand watch, creating a dedicated space in honor of Nikki. Whenever she shares a post on Facebook about Nikki's trial, it garners hundreds of likes and messages. Whenever she ventures into the city center, passers-by eagerly approach her, seeking to extend a handshake and show their support. Sharon has a plastic box filled with photographs, souvenirs, and documents. Inside were sympathy cards, replies to her letters seeking support, newspaper clippings, and even court summons and fines she'd incurred during her personal investigations. One letter on Buckingham Palace notepaper conveyed the Queen's sympathy for the tragic death of Sharon's daughter, Nikki, in 1992, but clarified that personal involvement was beyond Her Majesty's reach. Similarly, a response from the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister explained that due to parliamentary rules, an MP could not intervene on behalf of another MP's constituent, thus rendering assistance impossible. Among Sharon's possessions are some of Nikki's schoolwork. One noteworthy item is Nikki's news book, where she'd sketched a picture of herself happily skipping rope beside a slide. Underneath, she'd written, in slightly uneven handwriting, "My favorite sport is skipping because I enjoy jumping." In her religious education RE book, Nikki had written a prayer that resonated with her life by the docks. "We thank you for the fishermen who brave the waters to catch fish. We are grateful for the fish shops and the nourishment you provide us each day. Amen." Above the prayer, Nikki's drawn the flowing blue streak of the river, accompanied by images of a cod, a haddock, and a plaice. The date of the prayer was Thursday, September 24th, less than 2 weeks before her tragic passing. So this was the story of Nikki Allen and her mother Sharon, who would continue to fight for justice for her child long after others had given up. Do you think that the sentence of David Boyd was justified? Or do you think that Sharon's efforts will again bring a change in the law? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, do like and subscribe to the channel for more like this. We'd love to hear from you. If you have a case you'd like us to cover, do let us know. Until next time, stay safe, and thanks for watching.